The First Journal of Simon Fraser. Chapter 4. Fort McLeod to the Nechako River. Monday, June 23rd. Bad weather. It rained all the forenoon, and as Mr. Stuart had some work of our own to do, we did not set off till the afternoon. Came to the encampment at the cache where we found McLeod, who says that he lived well upon his own hunt all the time he has been here, and the dried provisions do not appear to have been touched. I left the post of Trout Lake in charge of Mr. James McDougall with only one man, Saucier, to pass the summer with him, but Saucier embarked with us to return from the cache with some ironworks, in order that the Indians may be supplied early in the fall with the necessary articles to kill beaver, so at present McDougall remains all alone. Spoke to and inquired of Basile Gervais, who appears still to be sick, if he was able to continue with us, and if not, that he would remain here, and that Saucier would take his place. He told me that he was not very able, but that he would continue and do his best, but that he feared, should he continue and become entirely disabled, that he would be reproached, in answer to which I told him that it would be very difficult for us to go up the current with only 3 men, and that this was the time for him to determine, while we had another man to replace him. But he seemed desirous of continuing, from which I infer that he is not much hurt, though La Malice told me that he was more so than he pretended to be, however, such as he was, that he would be better than any other we had, so we went to bed, without determining whether he would go or remain. The little head's brother-in-law killed a beaver which he gave us. Tuesday, June 24th, fine weather. Gave out the loading in the morning, which, including the provisions with the men's and our own things, is upwards of 20 pieces in each canoe, after which I inquired of Basile again if he was able and willing to accompany us, to which he replied that he was not very able, but that he was willing and desirous to continue on, but that I might do as I thought best. I told him, therefore, that he might continue. The afterman, Saucier, being both weak and sickly, and scarcely able to perform the duty of a middleman, much less that of a booth. And as Basile is hired as a foreman, I thought it best to put him, thinking it would be soon well. So we pushed off down the current until we came to the main river, and then I steered up a strong and rapidous stream. The water has lowered greatly since we passed here the 6th instant, just as we left the little river, i.e. the Pack River, and entered the large river, i.e. the Parsnip River. My canoe struck on a bank of gravel, and gave such a jerk that the foreman fell and hurt his side against the mater. We only came on about 2 miles, when we put ashore to breakfast, and in order to be more saving of the provisions, we weighed the pemmican and allowed 3 pounds. In the meantime, one of the canoes was taken out of the water to be gummed, and when they were near done, La Malice came and informed us that Basile was entirely disabled. This surprised and vexed me to see him in such a condition. He ought to have told us in the morning of his being so far gone. He seemed so desirous of accompanying us, that instead of being worse, I inferred that he was not really so ill as he pretended to be. Otherwise I would certainly have taken Saucier at once. Immediately ordered 6 men in one of the canoes to take Basile with his wife and baggage to where we left Saucier, making a pine canoe to return to Mr. McDougall's, and there leave him and take Saucier in his place. They were not absent 2 hours in this errand. On this occasion we lost 6 hours on shore gumming, sending back Basile and bringing Saucier, melting grease that was in bags and putting it in kegs. The carrier and the young man are ahead in a small canoe, and Tabitha Sand, Montange Debout, with their families, are on board our canoes. Came to and encamped, late opposite a high sandy bank. Tabitha killed a beaver, and the Montagne caught a fine trout, both of which they gave us. Had fine weather going all day, and could use either paddles or poles, the bottom being good as we chose. Wednesday, June 25th. Fine weather. We set off early and came on well all day, without loosing any time, excepting an hour and a half that was required to weigh the provisions for the people and allowing them time to eat, which they do on shore, and another at noon that Mr. Stuart took to observe. We came to and encamped a little before sunset near a small lake that the Indians said abounded with beaver. They went a-hunting but had no success, but they killed one before we encamped. Lamb paddled only at intervals today, he being unwell, and in the evening he declared him self-disabled and told Mr. Stuart that he was afraid that he was enruptured, but by the medicine he takes, for I never heard of a syringe being used for a rupture, it appears to me that it is the disease. But whatever it is, he appears to suffer very much and is quite disabled. It is really vexing that he did not inform us of being unwell before he left Trout Lake, as he would have been left there rather than be burdened with him along the voyage. Our situation is really critical with the set of awkward men we have, there not being even a good bouth, and all the bad places are yet to be passed. We could not provide ourselves with better men, there being none of that description at the Rocky Mountain Portage, excepting one, namely Grandbois, whom I sent down to Dunvegan with letters the beginning of April, and he remained there. Here we overtook the carrier and the young man who were ahead. We will be obliged to embark them, they having sent their canoe against a stump. It is quite broke and cannot be used any more. Thursday, June 26th. The Indians had left some of their paddles at the lake where they were last night looking for beaver, and as they were obliged to go for them this morning, it was 4:30 when we embarked. The current was very strong the most part of the day, and the water rises a little. We encamped a little before sunset. Friday, June 27. We set off at an early hour this morning and breakfasted at a considerable larger river that flows into the main on the left side. It is better than one half as wide as the one we navigated. After passing this river, the current slackened, and we went on well, but was obliged to put ashore on account of Lamb, where we lost 4 hours. As he could not sleep for several nights past, last night Mr. Stuart gave him 30 drops laudanum, and he complains of being worse, since, on which account we gave him a vomit. We were not far gone from this place when we came to a strong current and rapidous place of about 3 miles long, but above the current was slack, and we came on with great expedition, including the Indian women and all, there being 7 or 8 paddles in each canoe, and a little before sunset we found 4 young men of the Barbin's band exactly where Sir Alexander Mackenzie found the first Indians upon his expedition in 1793. Here we formed our encampment for the night. These young men informed us that they separated from the old Barbin some time ago, but that he is waiting for us, about half a day's march farther on. They likewise told us that they killed a bear this morning, the meat of which is yet to the fire, and as their lodges are near, they were going for it early tomorrow. Our hunters killed a beaver and a couple of outards, Canada geese. Lamb seems very weak and often delirious, and yet he eats as well as the others. Saturday, June 28th. The young men brought the meat of the bear early, and as it was cut up for to dry by the women, it was worth but 2 skins. 2 of the young men embarked with us to accompany us to the old Barbin, and it was past 5 when we set off. We did not continue more than 1/3 of a mile when we passed a river half as large as this that flows in upon the left. The current was very slack, and about noon we came to a river that flows in upon the left as large as the one we navigated. There we found the old Barbin, in the very identical spot he was found by Mr. Finlay in the summer of 1797. He has been here several days, waiting our arrival, and has 4 strangers with him, relations of his that never saw white people before. The old fellow went for them to the lakes at the height of land, so we can say with justice that he is the author of our seeing them at present. They examined us with great admiration and attention, and seemed quite pleased at meeting us. They say that ever since Mr. Finlay has been in this quarter that they kept hereabouts in hopes of seeing white people. As they promised to go to Trout Lake in the course of the summer and kill plenty of beaver to take with them, I gave them a few articles on credit. Traded 2 small pine canoes from the old Barbin to send our hunters ahead to kill beaver, there being a vast number from here to the height of land. We got no other provisions than a few small fish from these Indians. Soon after our arrival at the Indians, a heavy shower of hail fell, followed by the rain which continued the remainder of the day, which nevertheless did not prevent our setting off as soon as we had done with the Indians. It was 5 p.m. when we left the Indians, and we were accompanied by an elderly man, one of the strangers, and his sons, who returns to his wife and children, which he left at the height of land. We were not above half an hour gone when La Malisse jumped on shore, we being near the bank, and fell down senseless. This obliged us to put ashore and pitch our tents for the night in an abominable bad place, and no wood to make a fire. As it rained, we had much trouble to clear a place and unload the canoes, and after that was effected, Mr. Stuart returned to the place where we left the Indians with 6 men and all the nets, in order to set them, in case we should be obliged to remain here tomorrow on account of La Malisse. By all appearances, if he is really as bad as he pretends, he will not live long. We are all really ill off in regard to the men. Saucier is sick, Gagnon complains of his side, Blay of having a pain and a lump upon his stomach, and Gervais is not well, and Lalonde is not able to steer his canoe. Our hunters being ahead, and not knowing that we remain here, I sent 3 men for them in case they might be displeased at their women being here without themselves. They all returned before dark, and came back with an Indian, after he had prepared all the nets, and left the men there to set and take care of them, with orders to be here early in the morning. Sunday, June 29th. Rainy weather. The men were back early with the nets, but no fish. However, it was past 7 a.m. before La Malisse was ready to be off. About noon we were obliged to put ashore and light a fire to warm La Malisse and cook for him. He will not eat nothing but cakes and pemmican boiled up with flour and sweetened with sugar. This made us lose a couple of hours. We encamped about sunset in a bad place, and yet a better place could not be found on account of the country being low and marshy and overflowed with water. Monday, June 30th. Bad rainy weather, notwithstanding which we set off early, and soon passed a considerable river that flows in from the left, closed the place called, by Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the Beaver Lodge. About half a mile farther on, we passed another river on the right, and then put ashore to cook for La Malisse. Soon after we left the main branch on the left, and entered another small river on the right, the waters of which are very clear and deep. Sir A.M.K. represents this river as terminating in the mountains near at hand, but if the Indians be allowed to know better than him, it is not so, for they say that it is navigable much farther and terminates in a small lake where the Signeux en Bolaine. In many places this side of Trout Lake the river is shallow, and in the fall I am of opinion that canoes would not easily pass. This river I cannot understand, which hath its source. In its present state it is at least 50 yards wide, and the one we entered is 20 yards wide. All the large rivers that fall in from the left, this side of Trout Lake, the Indians represent as navigable for their canoes for a considerable distance, and say that they terminate in small lakes not far from one another, near the sources of the different brashes of the Signeux River, now the Pine River, where large animals are very numerous. Indeed, they represent them as plentiful at the distance of less than 2 days' march from this place, and if so, it would be an excellent station for a fort, but of this hereafter. The entrance of the first lake at the height of land was stopped with driftwood, But at the expense of some time and trouble, we opened a passage into the Arctic lake and advanced about 1.5 miles, where we found the strange Indian all ready, mentioned with his family, and also Ranchus the carrier, who came ahead with him yesterday. The former seems very intelligent and communicative. He gave us a great deal of information concerning this part of the country, and drew us a chart of it, at which he seemed very expert, but of all that he told us, the only thing worth mentioning is that had he been at Trout Lake, he said he would have shown us a more safe and shorter way to the Columbia, i.e., to the Fraser, by which he said we would have been at the carrier's land ere now, and that there was a portage of 1.5 miles at most from one of the lakes beyond Trout Lake into a fine navigable river, and no rapids that flows into the Columbia, actually the Fraser. He gave us a few fresh and a good many dried white fish and a little bear's fat, likewise 2 dressed and 1 green original skins, for which he got goods. We asked him to accompany us with his family to the next lake in order to show us the best fishing, to the next lake in order to show us the best fishing place and set, his own nets also. He immediately consented, and some of his children embarked on board our canoes, which himself and family soon followed in their small canoes. We continued to the extremity of the lake, about 3 miles, and there unloaded at the height of land, which is one of the finest portages I ever saw, between 600 and 700 yards long, and perhaps the shortest interval of any between the waters that descend into the northern and southern oceans. On entering the next lake, which is about 3 miles long, we began to glide with the current, and had much trouble in trying to force our way out of it to the next portage on account of the driftwood. Here we unloaded, and the canoes and baggage here, same as in the last portage. The distance is 160 yards to another lake, Pacific Lake, not quite so large as the last one, and here we formed our encampment for the night. Tuesday, July 1st. Very rainy bad weather. Notwithstanding, all the nets were set. Lamalice walked over both the portages, though we offered to carry him. He is very troublesome in his sickness, and called Mr. Stuart to his tent to tell him his mind, as he said, and inquired if either of us owed him a grudge. This he asked. He said because, while at the portage, we disregarded him, and now considered him no more than a dog. Mr. Stuart told him that if either of us owed him a grudge, or had anything to say to him, that we would not wait his being in his present weak condition to do it, and that if he had been in better health since he began the subject himself, he would perhaps tell him his opinion of himself and his sickness. This assertion of his, Lamalice, is entirely false. We have been attentive and kind to him. Nothing is more certain than that from the time he declared himself sick he was as well attended and taken care of as if it was one of ourselves, and notwithstanding his complaints, he used more than 1/2 of the medicines, God knows good or bad, we possessed, and destroyed more flour and sugar than both of us did since we left the portage, and yet he threatens to remain upon the beach and not embark, alleging that by agreement he is not obliged to voyage in this part of the country, and not well taken care of. When we prepared to leave him here with a bag of pemmican, exclusive of the other provisions we had, and a man to conduct him down to Trout Lake, not one of them would consent to remain unless absolutely compelled, and as he is brutish, and appears as if inclined to commit suicide. We did not think it right to compel a man to remain with him, so we will be obliged to take him with us, and attend to him the best way we can. And yet I must own that he is not very deserving, but it is a duty incumbent on one Christian to help another in distress, and we will continue to take care of him more for our own sake than his. I recollect when St. Pierre fell in a fit, the first instance, he was abandoned by Lamalice, and scarcely drawn out of the water, and when I afterwards reprimanded him for his apparent disregard of his duty as a Christian, even if he was indifferent to the feelings of humanity, he told me laughing that as he thought St. Pierre was dying, he left him to die alone, and set about mending his canoe, but now it is his turn to suffer, and he complains. He even said he would not embark unless we waited here a couple of days for him to see if he would get better, and that he was not obliged to voyage along any part of the Peace River, much less the waters that descend to the Pacific Ocean. But then he appears sometimes to be delirious and does not seem to know what he says, so in his present situation we must put up with him. It would be both ungenerous and inhuman to abandon him. Took up the nets that were set last night, but no fish in them, I suppose, owing to their being carelessly set late last night by the men. Mr. Stuart arranged them all properly and set them again. The Indians took a few white fish of a good size in their nets. Wednesday, July 2nd. Weather same as yesterday. Visited the nets in the morning and took some trout and some white fish, which were excellent. Indeed, the trout were of 5 different kinds, some of which I had never seen before, and the best I ever ate. On account of La Melisse and the badness of the weather, we did not set off until late in the after. Noon, and before our departure, we held a consultation about what we would do with La Melisse. As he appears very weak at times, and as he may make us lose much time, we are at a loss whether to leave him here with a man to conduct him to Trout Lake when he gets better, or take him with us. But it was the general opinion to take him with us, so we pushed off, and after passing the lake, which is not quite 3 miles long, we entered a small river, i.e. James Creek, between 15 and 20 yards wide, the current of which ran with great velocity. The passage from the lake to the river being choked up with driftwood, we had some trouble to clear our way. Near the entrance of the river we passed a couple of beaver dams, and soon got to a large tree that laid across the river, and it was with great difficulty that we prevented the canoes from running against it. But we soon cut the tree and continued at the risk of breaking the canoes, and we did not proceed far when they were so much hurt and leaked so much that we were obliged to put ashore and encamp. All hands were wet to the skin, especially Mr. Stuart and myself, being obliged to sit before the canoes and visit the shore in case the channel might be stopped. And it rained so hard that all our baggage is wet by the rain as well as the leakage of the canoes. Thursday, July 3rd. Rained constantly until noon, and for the remainder of the day at intervals. Mr. Stuart set off with 6 men and 11 pieces in one canoe to examine the river as far as the little lake. They returned late, after having encountered many obstacles, and broke a large hole in the canoe, which required a considerable time to repair. Our progress will be very slow now, as we will be continuously compelled to put the people of both canoes in one, on account of the current and rapids being too strong to be managed by 4 men, and none of them adroit. The navigation of the river is very dangerous, on account of it being narrow, the rent running so swift, and many trees, and embarrass laid across. Friday, July 4th. We set off early, with both canoes, as they were but lightly loaded, and continued for about 1½ miles, where we got to the head of a long and strong rapid, where we put some pieces on shore to be carried to the lower end, and the canoes were continued one after another by 6 men and 1 of ourselves. And though they were but lightly loaded, it was with much difficulty they were run down, and through the awkwardness of the men mine was run against a large embarrass in the middle of the river, which broke the bow and smashed all the pieces to the 2nd bar. Fortunately, there was not much water in the river, and the channel was narrow. All hands jumped out and pulled the wreck on shore before it had time to fill and sink. We lost the most part of the day to mend it, and after all the entraves being broken to pieces, and no wood to work at to make another or a sufficient quantity of bark, it could not be put so well as it was before. This labor always falls to Mr. Stuart's lot, there being no other person that can do it. While some of the people were employed about the canoe, I sent 5 men down with the other canoe and 7 pieces to the little lake, and they returned in the evening, and my canoe being mended, we went down with both and arrived after sunset. The Indians came down on foot through the woods and set their nets. We set one of ours also. N.B. Yesterday the goods were aired a little, but could not be dried properly on account of the rain that fell at intervals. Saturday, July 5th. The weather was cloudy, both today and yesterday. At an early hour this morning I started with 6 men and 12 pieces, but soon put 5 of them on shore, and continued with the remainder for about 3 miles, and there left them and returned with the canoe. This distance is a continual rapid. We carried the canoe across an embarrass and cut several trees that were fallen across the river. During my absence, Mr. Stuart got all the property properly dried, which it was much in need of, and he returned down with another half-load and will return in the morning. Sent all the Indians down on foot, in order to lighten our canoes. There was no fish caught at this place excepting a few jut that the Indians caught in their nets, and we saw no beaver along the river. But a caribou crossed the lake, which nevertheless escaped. Lummerlis seems to be better than he was for some time past. Likely he will be well when we get out of the river. He begins to find fault with the men, and has strength to quarrel and beat his lady. I cannot comprehend his sickness. He has always had a good appetite, and complains only of a severe pain in his bowels and privates. Sunday, July 6th. Cloudy weather with some rain. Mr. Stuart returned at 8 a.m. The water rises fast, for the pieces I left yesterday near at hand were found by Mr. Stuart almost in the water, though they were upward of 1.5 feet above the level when I left them on my return here, and the interval was not above 3 hours. We continued with both canoes until the place where the pieces were left yesterday, and from there Mr. Stuart continued with one canoe, 6 men and 12 pieces for about 1.5 miles, where they were obliged to unload and carry over a point of 200 yards. There they left their load and returned here. On their way down they had many trees and embarrass to cut, and in performing that, one of the men dropped a large axe and was near drowning himself besides. As soon as they returned we set off with both canoes, but mine broke against an embarrass about 1/3 of a mile above the Portage, which obliged us to unload and take down the canoe light. This causes a considerable delay, as all the pieces were carried from this place to the Portage, where we formed our encampment for the night. The Indians are ahead. We did not see them since yesterday. Mr. Stuart and I went down the river for about 1.5 miles to examine what difficulties we would have to encounter tomorrow. We had such bad walking that it was past 11 o'clock when we came back to the tents. Monday, July 7th, rained all day, notwithstanding which we started early with one canoe and a half-load, and went down for about 2 miles, where we unloaded, where there was an embarrass in the middle of the river, and from thence returned to our encampment, and there went off with both canoes, but were obliged to carry the canoes and load over the embarrass, which was a difficult job on account of its height, though not much more than 30 paces. From this we got down about 1.5 miles in the usual way of sending a canoe ahead to examine, lightly loaded with 6 men and one of ourselves, and afterwards bringing down both together with the remainder of the loads to a succession of falls and rapids, where we were obliged to open a road wide enough to admit of the canoes and baggage being carried over a point of 800 yards, which was completed by the conclusion of the day, and the pieces carried better than halfway. I went down 1 mile on foot, and as far as I could see it was a succession of falls and rapids. Gave all hands a dram to cheer up their spirits after their violent exertion during the whole day. All hands worked hard, and Mr. Stuart and my share of the labor is the most difficult, as we not only work in the canoes the same as the others, but are obliged either one or the other to examine the river on foot before we risk the canoes, so that as soon as we arrive with the canoe at the place we return from on foot, we embark again to examine farther on. Kenchus arrived from the large river, where we left the other Indians making small canoes to kill beaver, of which he says there are many. He likewise says the distance from there to the large river is not great but bad walking. Tuesday, July 8th. Still raining all day, same as yesterday. At 11 o'clock, Mr. Stuart went off with Kenchus to determine the distance and the best road from here to the large river, and returned at sunset, after having been at the Said River, i.e. the McGregor River, cold, wet, and hungry, having walked the most part of the time in water up to the knees. He says the distance is not great, but that there is a steep hill to ascend, and that it would be difficult to carry over it, and more so to the remainder of the distance, sometimes in water up to the middle. They did not see any vestiges of the night's road, or see the hunters that are ahead. They seem to have gone down the river, and in tracing their road, Mr. Stuart and Kenchus lost themselves, but in coming back they traced the river a long piece, and Mr. Stuart is of opinion that the lower part will be less difficult than the past. Mr. Stuart has his hands much swollen, the effects of his violent exertions, and being generally wet since in this river, or else of his having passed amongst poisonous weeds. At noon I began with 2 men to open the road about a mile farther down, and the other 6 men carried both canoes over the road that was opened last night, and ran them down one after another, a long and dangerous rapid with 5 pieces in each. This laborious task of carrying and running down the canoes and opening the road, all hands began to carry, and took all the baggage to the end of the road by sunset, excepting Lamalis, who is yet at the other end of the Portage. But there are 6 men gone to stop there, and will be here early tomorrow with him. The people are more fatigued today than any day yet on account of the road being so bad, and the canoes have become so weighty that 2 men cannot carry them 100 yards without being relieved, gave all hands a dram, and I believe it is the first time that Mr. Stuart and myself could relish a glass of high wines. Wednesday, July 9th. It was late before the canoes was brought over the portage and the canoes gummed, after which we set off with 1 canoe, 6 men, and 12 pieces, and continued for 1.25 miles, where we were stopped by fallen trees and embarras, which rendered it necessary to unload and open a road to carry the canoes and baggage over a low point of 190 yards, after which we returned for the remainder of the baggage, and continued on in the same manner until night, alternately by land and water. The canoes were broke and spoiled greatly this day. We met the Montagne de Bouth coming before us from the large river, and he says that they have made pine canoes and have killed 5 beaver. This place we suppose to be the low spot where Sir Alexander Mackenzie carried across the neck of land to the large river. He was misinformed in saying it terminated in various branches. Mr. Stuart, who was down yesterday at the large river, now the McGregor River, traced this river for some time, and afterwards crossed it in many places, is of opinion that we will be able to get to its confluence with the canoes, and the Montagne de Bouth account of it agrees with his. Therefore, we intend to continue by water as far as we can. All the goods are entirely wet, and the provisions are spoiling. When we arrived at this place, the canoes were no more able to float, their bottoms being entirely hashed, and after getting bark and gathering some gum, we patched them up for the present. The weather was cloudy all day, and towards the evening it rained. Thursday, July 10th. Pine weather. After the canoes were gummed a little, we continued on and had better going than we had reason to expect. The river, right branch, is narrow, but plenty of water to bear the canoes, and the current is not strong, which enabled us to continue on with both canoes with their full loads on. At 10 a.m. we arrived at the large river, i.e. the Fraser, opposite an island, without encountering any other difficulty than cutting several trees that laid across the channel, and we were most happy at having avoided the long and bad carrying place and seeing ourselves once more on the banks of a fine and navigable river. This is a fine river, and not unlike the Athabasca, but not so large, and the Indian we left at the height or point of land informed us that the upper end of it was the most ordinary residence of the Sais, Thou Denes, Balkana Indians, which corroborates with what the carriers tell us of these Indians, they being enemies, when they go hunting in that quarter. I have seen one that was wounded last summer, and his brother was killed, which is likely the same that was mentioned by one of the Bokan Indians last winter at Dunvegan as being killed there. All accounts agree that large animals, as well as those of the fur kind, are in great abundance, particularly towards the upper end. Could this be relied upon, and that the Bokan Indians are really thereabouts? An establishment, in my opinion, would be well placed at the point of land. There is excellent fish in the 3 lakes, and in 2 of them salmon abounds in its season, and by all accounts animals are not far off. Indeed, of this we had ocular demonstration ourselves, so that people would live well there. A no immaterial object, a not unimportant matter in this quarter, and the Bokan Indians would be much more easily got to come there than to any part of the Peace River, on account of their being afraid of the Beaver Indians, and the big men, i.e. the McLeod Lake Indians, though they seldom meet, they live in amity. Sir Alexander Mackenzie seems to have examined the Bad River, i.e. James Creek, with attention, for as far as he went down in peace, he describes it with great exactness. It is certainly well named and a most dangerous place, being much intersected with large stones, fallen trees, and emberas, and the current runs with such velocity that a canoe, though light, cannot be stopped with poles, and it is with great difficulty it can be done by laying hold of the branches, and even that way we often drifted 100 and sometimes 300 yards from the time we began to hold the branches before we could bring to. Near its confluence it divides into 3 branches, all of which I suppose to be navigable, but the one to the right is the best route. We were anxiously looking for cedar and maple along the banks of the river, but to no effect. I walked myself, except in very few places, from one end to the other, but saw no appearances of either. Neither did any of the others. Hemlock and the Suven tree we saw in great plenty, but of a lesser size than those of Trout Lake and the lakes of the Heights of Land, which is about 1/3 more large than he makes them. We saw plum of small growth, and between that place and trout, i.e. McLeod, lake elder, of upwards of 4 feet in circumference. La Montagne de Bout and Buelleres waited for us at the entrance of the river, and we continued down to where Tabata was waiting for us, and there put ashore to dry the property and repair the many injuries the canoes had received coming down the Bad River. Sent 4 men to procure gum and bark, and the others were employed spreading out everything that was wet. Those who were sent for bark and gum soon returned with a sufficient quantity of both, and all hands set about mending and gumming the canoes. The hunters brought us 5 beaver, which afforded all hands a hearty meal, and La Malise, who was walking about, arrived too late to get the share he wished. We had given 3 to the men, and the best part of another was cooking for ourselves, so there remained only 1 for him. He says he feels but little pain now, but that he is still weak. Before the canoes were prepared and everything prepared, it was past 5 p.m., but the current is so very swift that we ran 21 miles before night. Tabata killed a beaver, and the others missed several shots on that sagacious animal, which is plentiful along this river, and it is not destitute of large animals, for we saw several moose and red deer tracks, with that of the caribou also. Friday, July 11th. Fine weather. We set off early and came on with great expedition, and before we entered the Great Fork, where the Nechako River joins the Fraser, passed several rapids, but the current is slack in many places. The banks of the river is well stocked with wood, and we saw hemlock and cedar of a large size, with some small plum. At sunset, we got to the Nechako River. This river is not mentioned by Sir Alexander Mackenzie, which surprises me not a little, it being full in sight and a fine large river, and in the state we saw it equal in size to that of the Athabasca River and forms that Mr. McDougall, in his journal of last spring, calls the Great Fork. It flows in from the right, and as far as I can judge, about 10 or 12 miles above the first portage. Sir Alexander Mackenzie appears to have been very inaccurate in the courses, or there must have been a vast difference in the compass he made use of and the one we had, which is old and perhaps not very good. As for the distance, I say nothing. It is difficult to determine by sight, but the course of the river is different, and out to agree, at least the difference, that leads to the carrier's Stuart Lake, where Mr. McDougall was last spring, and then formed our encampment on a sandy bank and no wood, which with the rain that fell towards the night and continued until the morning rendered our situation not very pleasant. Mr. Stuart took the course of the river and minute remarks of everything. Saturday, July 12th. Rained at intervals. Set off early up the Nechako River, but the current is so strong and the canoes so leaky that we cannot advance much. In the forenoon, having seen old tracks of red deer, and as the Indians by walking, for they left their canoes this morning, will be able to gain much time on the canoes, we put them on shore in order to hunt. They only crossed a couple of points when they came to us and said that they had seen no fresh tracks. In the afternoon we gummed the canoes and lost nearly 2 hours performing that, and mending a hole that broke in the bottom of my canoe. Indeed, my foreman is so awkward that the canoe is almost continually aground or runs against stumps. Here the Indians went off with their women and children, being in hopes of finding natives along the river near at hand. We continued on until after sunset, and encamped on the left shore opposite a high bank of clay. After unloading the canoes, I sent 4 men with one of them to cross the Indians, who had embarked on the right shore. Yesterday we finished the remainder of our pemmican, and today broke open the pounded meat, which we ate without grease. Our progress is very slow, having made only 9 miles today. The river is entirely overflown. No use can be made of the poles, and the current is too strong to be steered by the paddles, and we make more use of the branches of trees and bushes along the banks than of both. Sunday, July 13th. Rained at intervals, and at 4:30 we were upon the water, and soon passed several temporary posts erected for the summer. Yesterday we passed some likewise, and our guide Kenchus is in momentary expectations of seeing some of his countrymen. About noon we went a little out of our way in a small in hopes of seeing strangers, but there was not even any fresh vestiges, but we saw aught not to be great. The banks of the river is beautiful, in many places resembling that of the river Lac La Pluie, and the liard, i.e. poplar, is the most stupendous I ever saw. As for any other wood or anything else remarkable, we saw none that is not already mentioned. The narrow gut where there are rocks, which Sir Alexander Mackenzie compares to a stupendous pile of Gothic churches, we examined with attention, but according to our ideas find no resemblance. They are steep rocks, and in some places almost perpendicular, of a coarse and apparently hard kind of stone. We entered the river by which the Indian, whom we saw at the height of lands, informed us there was a more short and safer passage into the Columbia, i.e. the Fraser, at its confluence. It is about 80 or 90 yards wide, and by what we can judge, from the short distance we went up, is a fine navigable river with a moderate current, which I may say is the only one of that description I have seen in this quarter, for all the rivers in the vicinity of the mountains run with great velocity. This river likewise flows in from the right. Two old pine canoes, which seem to have been left there in the spring. Here all the Indians, Barbuellen excepted, who was kept to paddle, barked to go to another lake in search of Indians, and we continued our route for about 2 miles, when we put ashore to gather gum at a place that seemed to be much frequented by the natives. About 4 p.m., as we were advancing inside of an island, we saw 2 bear cubs in a tree, and immediately pulled ashore to fire upon them. But before we could get to them they were off, and Lagarde and Barbuellen, who were the first on shore, pursued them. The latter soon met the mother, and fired upon her to no effect, and she pursued him in her turn. But he being near the water, he jumped in, and she after him, but soon left him. And as Lagarde was advancing, another bear suddenly rushed upon him and tore him in a shocking manner. Had not the dogs passed there at that critical moment, he would have been torn to pieces. The bear left him to defend herself against the dogs, and during the interval he ran off and jumped into the river, and from thence it was with much difficulty he could walk to the canoe. He received 9 or 10 bad wounds, and we encamped early to dress them. We are really unfortunate in regard to the men. One of the canoes will be now obliged to continue with 3, and no great help can be expected. The Indians, except the Montagne de Bout, who returned to encamp with us on account of his having his son on board the canoe, are ahead. Monday, July 14th. It was rather late before we set off on account of our having Lagarde's wounds to dress before our departure. At 9 a.m. we came to an Indian house that was situated on the end of an island, and opposite on the right shore there were 2 tombs neatly erected. There we breakfasted, and from thence soon got to a long rapid, where we were obliged to unload and carry 1/2 of the loads, and put the people of both canoes in one to take them up one after another, which nearly occupied the remainder of the day. And by the time that the canoes were gummed and ready to be off, the sun was near set. However, we set off and encamped about 2 miles above the rapid. As Tabata and his wife were walking along the banks of the river, they surprised a large grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. The Indian fired upon the mother and wounded her, in revenge of which she jumped upon his wife, and she instantly laid down flat upon the ground and did not stir, in consequence of which the bear deserted her and ran after her husband, who likewise fortunately escaped unhurt and killed one of the young, which he brought to the canoe. He was immediately sent back with other Indians in search of the one he wounded, which they found and killed with 7 shots, and brought the meat to the canoe, which made all hands a couple of good meals. Tuesday, July 15th. Several showers of rain fell in the course of the day. At an early hour that morning we pushed off against a strong current. In the forenoon, going up a long steep bank, my foreman negligently pushed out the bow of the canoe, which made it wheel round and broke the bow against the other canoe that was inside, which caused a delay of 3 hours to mend, and for want of having the necessary materials it was but imperfectly done after all. Kanchuse and Tabata, who walked on shore, saw some fresh vestiges of Indians, and the former saw a dog crossing the river. We encamped a little before sunset upon the right shore. The canoes are becoming so leaky that a man is almost constantly employed to keep them clear of water. Distance about 12 miles. Wednesday, July 16th. We set off early, but the canoes took as much water as ever, though they were gummed last night, which obliged us to put ashore at 11 a.m., to perform the same operation and mend the bow of the one that was broke yesterday. In the meantime, everything that was wet was spread out to dry, and before everything was dry and the canoes ready to be off, it was 5 p.m., at which time we pushed off and continued on for 3 miles without much current. When we got to the foot of a strong rapid of 2 miles long, and which we ascended by pulling the branches, and were obliged to cut several trees that laid across the way. It was past 9 p.m. when we got to the upper end, where the Indians had arrived, and had kindled a fire both for themselves and us. As the people were taking one of the canoes of the water, the stern got into the current and filled instantly with water, and it was very near breaking before it could be emptied and taken up the hill, which was high and steep. Thursday, July 17th. Having arrived last night too late to gum the canoes, we were under the necessity of performing that operation this morning before we set off, and it was 7 a.m. before we took our departure. And we did not advance above 2 miles when we got to the foot of a cascade and a long rapid, where our guide can choose, a damned blockhead that never passed through this country before, I believe, informed us that it was fine going on the left shore. Accordingly, we traversed and went up but a very short distance when we were obliged to stop and mend the bow of my canoe, which got such a thump upon a tree that shattered it so much that it could continue no longer upon the water in the state it was in. Here we dried the baggage again, and though all hands were busy, we lost 7 hours on shore, after which we continued on, and by the assistance of the line and pulling by the branches went up several strong and dangerous points for the distance of better than a mile to a strong point under a perpendicular rock where we were at a standstill and no possibility of ascending it, there being no bottom for the poles and no possibility of employing the line, and there were no branches to pull by. Neither could a portage be made on account of the perpendicular rocks, and to attempt crossing to the other side would be little short of madness, for the canoes would have been smashed to pieces against the large cascades and stones that were in the way. In this critical situation, we had no other resource than to return down by the way we came, which was soon effected by drifting down along shore and laying hold of the branches to prevent it going too fast, and we crossed over to the right shore at the same place we left in the morning, where we unloaded and carried the canoes and baggage up a very steep bank, which was with difficulty effected, and then we worked a while, making a road. Friday, July 18th. Early in the morning the men cut a road of 300 yards in length, wide enough to carry the canoes, which they brought with all the baggage to the upper end. From thence they set off with only one canoe, on account of the current being strong, and several rapids to pass, which they could not ascend with less than 6 men, and continued for 1.5 miles. In the above distance they carried the canoe and loading over a point about twice the length of the canoe, and from the upper end of the rapid returned for the other canoe, which was effected at 1 p.m. From thence we continued up a strong and constant current, where we made a small portage, and soon got to a high point of perpendicular rock, where we had much trouble to pass and fix a line. Here all hands, excepting one man that was taking care of the other canoe, was put to one canoe, but as they were hauling it up the last cascade it wheeled round, and the foreman was obliged to cut the line, and they went down to the foot of the rapid before they could bring to. As this happened through the awkwardness of the people, I made them unload everything and bring it up a very steep hill, rather than risk everything in the canoe. We encamped upon a beautiful hill. The canoes were left on the water all tied, it being too late to take them up the rapid, and impossible to take them up the hill on account of the steepness. The Indians are ahead, but about sunset the Montagne de Butte came before us to get provisions for himself and family. Instead of feeding us, we have been obliged to provide for them, and as yet they have been of no manner of use to us, and I am almost sorry for taking them. This is the end of the first journal of Simon Fraser. Thank you for listening.